Imagine your worst day. The internet goes out, your kid is sick, and your boss is screaming at you for a project on deadline at the end of the day. And your car won't start in the cold. In the moment, it can all feel like too much to handle. But what if you actually had a plan? A plan B to help you navigate when everything seems to be going wrong. Maybe you tether your laptop to your phone if the internet goes out. Or if your kid gets sick often, you add some vitamins or healthy foods to their meals. And if work deadlines always seem impossible, set a few earlier ones to give yourself a cushion. I know. The idea is to be prepared, so when the worst day happens, you've got these options. But like exercising to stay healthy, it's easier said than done. Now, imagine you're running a utility. You can't afford to have the water or the power just stop. People's lives depend on it. Suddenly, your worst day is a whole new level of high stakes. So, how do you prepare for that? Can you switch to a manual system in case of a failure? Has your team actually practiced that? In a moment, we'll hear from a consultant who helps his clients plan for their best worst days. And we'll hear about a water district outside of Kansas City, Kansas, that had its best worst day by keeping the water flowing despite a cyber attack. This is a story about having an emergency plan for a cyber attack and actually practicing against it. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
I am Dave Gunter, Director of OT Cybersecurity at Armexa in the IT/OT cybersecurity space. A lot of time spent working in the field, a lot of time dealing with customers, a lot of time understanding the OT challenges that we have out there. Armexa is an OT cybersecurity consulting firm. The team is made up with a host of folks that have real-world pragmatic experience. They've worked in oil and gas, chemical, water, wastewater, manufacturing, in the engineering and operations environments. They've had the hard hats on. They've been called out at 3 a.m. in the morning. They truly have a grasp of the challenges and the opportunities to improve OT cybersecurity defenses within your facility.
So we're going to be talking about a water and waste treatment plant in Kansas. I asked Dave to tell us a little bit more about what happened. I believe the event was in September of 2024.
Yeah, the event in Kansas is interesting because it was we kind of responded to a blog that was out there, a newsprint that was out there that basically stated that they were under an attack. It didn't go into definitions of exactly what happened, but they switched to manual mode and then they kind of ran the facility. And it was an interesting, having worked in that space, what was interesting about it is the fact that they switched to manual mode and they ran, and there was no upsets in water quality. There was no upsets in production or throughput. They were able to kind of ride through it and then get the systems back up and restored. And that was interesting because a lot of times in the water and wastewater industry, they talk about, when you do a risk assessment and things like that, they talk about being able to run in manual. But it's not always as easy as you think it is. There's a lot of aspects there, like some of the equipment that's in the field. It'll give you ranges of 0 to 100%. And you really don't know what that is from a flow standpoint unless you have the right engineering calculations or you have the right information in front of you to tell you what that is from a flow or from a pressure standpoint. But the ability to run in manual and ride out a cybersecurity attack and not have an interruption, and then reassure the community that the water is safe to drink, is really fundamental to the water industry. It's something they have to do, and they have some significant challenge in that area.
So just to lay something to rest quickly, the water system is a heavily regulated environment in that they test the water periodically. There's a number of checks and balances before it actually ends up in your faucet. So the security of that water system is probably good.
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing that. The Safe Drinking Water Act, established in 1972. I would say that they have manual checks and cross checks, but everything actually goes back to modern systems, everything goes back to data, everything goes back to the computer system, and it goes back to the servers. Years ago, that was all done by a checklist, and a clipboard. The operator made the rounds. They took the piece of paper, saved it, and then they put their report in. It's not that way anymore. So it relies a lot on the servers and the information that the system collects. Now, when you lose that, then you actually have to have a backup to that. And fortunately, in this case, they had all of that information. They were able to write it out. So I think that's the real lesson learned here is you can lean on that technology. It's great, but you also have to have that backup in case you have an anomaly like this.
So when speaking of an anomaly like this, there was an event outside of Houston, Texas, and there was also an event outside of Pittsburgh. All water treatment plants attributable to different threat actors, but nonetheless, it seems like there's interest in looking at the U.S. water system in particular.
Yes, there is, and it really goes to any critical infrastructure. The CISA has the 16 areas of critical infrastructure, but it really goes back to where we're at in society right now. I mean, we are in a world where there's an advanced persistent threat upon anything that can cause a little bit of chaos. And I use that advanced persistent threat, and I'll use a reference here. Lockheed Martin has a great model called a cyber kill chain. And it's pretty simple that these folks do reconnaissance out there. They look for targets that they can gain information from, okay? And once they understand what that information is from a reconnaissance standpoint, they look to weaponize what they have. They look for a delivery concept. They look to exploit it. They look for installation processes and how would your bug or your hack get inside the company and do damage. And then they do damage on command and control if they can, down to a PLC level or even an HMI level. HMI is usually the lighter lift and getting down to the PLC level. And then they take actions on the physical world. And because they have this kind of pre-mapped out process, it becomes, targets of opportunity. So if you have water, wastewater, if you have any public infrastructure grid or things like that, the more information you gain from that reconnaissance process just kind of sets the stage. Water and wastewater affects the general public. So the last thing, the last thing any of us want is to turn on the faucet and have an issue with the water that we're drinking or have a concern about it. And it's real and it affects people and it affects your family and your community. So it is a high value target, as we would call it, in terms of how it would impact the public.
The event in Kansas was a ransomware attack, which, in my opinion, would be at a higher level, like a network level, and not necessarily at the HMI or PLC level.
Well, the ransomware will attack, PCs, Windows-based PCs, and just lock them up. And those machines, actually, the PLC reports the data back. So if you're looking at the pressure or whatever you're looking at the operator user interface or the human machine interface, as they would call it. And those machines can get ransomware on them. The PLCs are user-built code or manufacturer-based code. It's not usually not a Windows-based PLC. So it's any Windows-based devices typically fall into that category of where they can catch that ransomware, and it could give you a loss of view. So even though your control system might be operating perfectly, you have a loss of view. And you just don't know what's going on. You don't know pressures, you don't know temperatures, you don't know flows, and you don't know analytical measurements and things like that. So you really got to drop back to a manual mode and kind of figure out, okay, how do I restore view after you get stabilized operations? And then you got your crew out there and everybody knows what they have going on. And then you take a step back and start investigating and move to that stable operations. And then you move to recovery. But at the same time, you have to kind of address the public. You have to do that incident response part of the puzzle to reassure them, look, we're running in manual and there's no issues with the quality of the water. And that's kind of the key thing to reassure folks that there are no issues. I think that's kind of crucial in this type of aspect because we all, like you said, we all turn this faucet on and we trust what's coming out is good.
So why are municipalities, water districts in this case, being attacked with ransomware? They're not billion-dollar corporations. They don't really have the funds. Is there an ulterior reason why they're being attacked?
Threat and fear and whatever information. It's a low-hanging fruit. They don't have the money to actually secure it the way they should. None of us want to see our water bill go up. All right, that's number one. We all consume it. None of us want to see it go up. But I do believe fundamentally that we live in a world now where we have to secure things. And, just like our banking information, things like that, these water companies are going to have to address it, whether they have a separate line item as far as cybersecurity for the water system or whether it's baked into the cost. It doesn't really matter, but it has to be addressed. As far as the threat and why them, just because of social media and the press impact, and it's affecting a lot of people. It's not just affecting, somebody personally got compromised or something. You're talking about a gross, large volume of people that are being affected by it. And the information, reconnaissance, and things like we discussed may be out there. So those combination of factors can lead you to the position of, oh, I found this. I have this level of reconnaissance. The system's semi-open. They don't have the staff to support it as well as it should. They don't have the staff to support it as securely as it should be. And they're kind of on their own. What a great target of opportunity. I mean, it's not a moral or ethical thing to do whatsoever. However, the information may be out there and they may trip over it. And not anything to cause chaos is kind of the state of the day.
And the puzzling thing is these tend to be smaller utilities that are being attacked, probably because they don't have the resources.
Yes. I mean, they just don't. I mean, I live in a very small community and, they just don't have the resources. But if you go to these larger communities, larger metropolitan areas, they have a larger footprint of client or a larger footprint of consumer and industrial clients. It just changes the dynamic of what kind of funds they have available to them. But in small rural areas or small towns, you're just not going to see that footprint. And that's a struggle for them. I mean, I look at them and I feel bad for them because they have to balance that risk of being attacked versus telling the community, look, your water is going to go up in price because of cybersecurity concerns. And that's always a public hearing, and it's never an easy thing for those folks. So I kind of sympathize with them in one case, but it's getting to the point now where you have to address it in some way, shape, or form.
And some of these systems are old because they can't modernize as quickly as, say, a larger municipality.
Absolutely. And, obsolescence is, and just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it can't be secured. There's a whole host of pragmatic things you can do to secure it. I mean, the last thing you want to do is walk into a facility. I've done lots of risk assessments and say, hey, your entire system has to be rebuilt and you have to upgrade everything. And, here's a $30 million price tag. And that's just not pragmatic. You just can't do that. There are methods, tools, approaches, and things you can do to secure those things, whether it's the countermeasure list that you have and laying some of those things out, whether it's understanding, what you can actually get away with. I mean, we always use the term consequence of compromise. What does a bad day look like? Okay, I mean, what is the worst case scenario? And then you start backing up from there, and then you segment the system, segregate the system, and understand the unit ops. And then you can really take a step back and say, this is the best place to spend my security dollars here because it's the highest risk. And some of those technologies may lead you down the path of, okay, I don't really have a good way to run in manual. Can I run in manual? In most cases, the water industry can. So then you might take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to secure my system, but I also am going to make some step changes and do some things, write some procedures and policies to be able to run in manual just in case. And the Kansas City or the Kansas water system where they come out and they were able to do that was kind of a great example of that. But to your point, it is obsolete. There are some state of the art facilities, but managing obsolescence, IT does it every day. OT has to do it with cyber as they get more and more mature. Plan it out. Not necessarily just walk in and say, we're going to do it all tomorrow, but plan out the obsolescent changes that they need.
And this is true in other industries as well.
Well, it's dependent on the industry and the process unit. And, and that's why, whenever you are conducting a risk assessment, it's been my experience that when someone says, oh, we'll just run a manual, you got to take a step back and drill that because it's easy to say, but it's not always easy to do. And you ask the $1 million question, well, do you have procedures? Do you have policies? Do you have this and that? And you kind of get a mixed bag of answers. But the reality is you typically should be able to run or stabilize the system in manual And that's typically what you're able to do. But some of the more complex things, there are things that you just can't run in manual, or things that cannot be compromised. And there's a whole different risk assessment kind of view on that. But for the most part, the water industry, they can drop back to manual. They have the ability because everything has a lot of time and residence time built in from a process standpoint. So that's the good part of it. But from a procedure policy, and do you have the staff? Can you run it? Are all the radios positions? Can you talk back and forth? Do you know what to do when you need to do it? That's the part where you have to kind of dig a little deeper to make sure everybody knows what they got to do.
So I'm wondering, does the Water ISAC, for example, have some best practices?
Yeah, there's a host of organizations out there that have best practice. I know the AWWA has a bunch of them. There's no shortfall of information to secure the systems. It's all over the place. There's published industry standards. There's NIST frameworks on how to secure the standards. There's IEC 62443 3-2 on how to conduct risk assessments. There is a host of standards and informations. Then there's like you said, the ISAC, and there's the advisory from the AWWA and the other organizations. There's a host of them, tons of information. The problem is you really need to break that down into pragmatically a consequence-based risk view, because otherwise you're just doing things for the sake of doing them. Meaning, I'm going to go shut down all USBs, or I'm going to go this, and I'm going to go do that. You do a bunch of common sense things, and then you ask yourself, okay, did I really mitigate the risk? And sometimes that's hard to answer. I mean, you put things in place, but are you prepared to ride out a ransomware event in manual, just like we just discussed? And that's the $1 million point. Consequence-based risk assessment drives your security spend to a path that addresses the bad day. And I think that's really where you need to focus, because it's kind of just doing things does not build a cybersecurity program. You have to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that consequence-based risk assessment looks at the actual risk based on process constraints or process issues.
Are there commonalities from client to client that you've seen that you could aggregate here, like things that are most common on those bad days?
Well, I think that can aggregate itself based on sector, okay, like industry sector. So oil and gas or refining, midstream, upstream. There are some, but it also boils down to the company themselves and how their view of risk is. And I kind of align it closely with process safety or safety. So if you look at from a safety standpoint, and it says, okay, this particular event happens where we have a high pressure and you require a safety system to kick into place where the sensor measures it. You get a logic solver that makes a decision and a valve that would close. That right there is an event where that logic solver could be compromised. So if you use that as your basis and say, I'm going to look at the safety review for this particular plant, then you have the conditions and you have all the cause and effects of what a bad day would look like. And then you just run them back through cyber. And that's what Armexa specializes in. In various industries like water and wastewater, they don't typically do those studies because there's not a lot of process safety risk. So you really got to take a step back and ask the operators and ask the folks that are there, what's the bad day look like? And I know that sounds parochial and I apologize, but you really need to say, okay, what happens if you lose this? What happens if you lose that? What's that server do? What's this? And you have to go through it from a operations standpoint of what they can ride out and what they can't.
So we talked earlier about ransomware taking advantage of Windows systems, but there is at least one example this year of a water district that was a vulnerability in a communications protocol, an open source communications protocol. So knowing you have to update your PLCs, how often does that happen? Or is it something that security controls or layering can mitigate?
The answer is both, depending on what you have and depending on what you have. I mean, look, open protocols we know traditionally are they're just you can consider them compromised because the code's out there. You just really want to move away from some of the open protocols. However, they're so ingrained in some of the systems out there, you kind of got to think about the terms segmentation, segregation, and separation. And you really got to look at the network, and you got to look at the tools that you have in the tool bag to do that. And also what the risk is. If the risk is far too great, where if that communication protocol was compromised, you make the case to replace that. You make the case to do that, but it's all based on risk. You don't just blindly apply it. You got to look at the risk impact.
So Dave mentioned segmentation. Are you seeing segmentation in water districts, or are these flattened networks?
Yeah, water's kind of all over the map. I've seen some segmented water systems that were, kind of first class, and then I've seen some ones that were extremely flat. But at the end of the day, the flatter the network, the more the surface, the more attack surface you have. You really got to do that segmentation thing. You got to take a step back and plan it, and get yourself to a point where you can make the impact by actually segmenting that out, either by process unit, by technology, or by separation of IT and OT, and really establish that OT function, OT security function within a water plant. And that's kind of the key, because then when someone owns it, someone takes care of it. If no one owns it, if you ask someone who is responsible for OT security in this facility, I always ask that question. And if folks pause, don't answer the question, that kind of tells you that there's really no one in charge.
And with these smaller municipalities, it's like they're strapped to get one IT person on staff, but to have an OT person, yeah, well, that's kind of a dream.
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. And that's where you can use a series of consultants and some folks that come in and can actually do risk assessment stuff, and they can actually implement some of the changes and have a trusted partner and advisor. But I do fundamentally believe that is going to be the challenge. And the water industry in particular, if you talk to those folks, they have a massive skill gap, where they don't have the seasoned trained operators they used to have. And if folks are coming out of, typically the folks that are coming out with operation experience in the military and things like that, they're going into most likely higher risk chemical or oil and gas refinery and things like that. And they're not always settling out in water and wastewater. Some of them are, and some of them aren't. But the bottom line is there's a big skill gap for them technically, and coming up to speed on that is going to take some time.
And so one thing I've learned over my 2 decades in security is that if I tell a company to spend $1 million on a product and they don't have an attack, is it because they spent the $1 million, or is it because they weren't targeted in that given attack? I imagine these water districts are really pressed to find security money when they go to the city council or whatever board they need to get the funding.
And years ago, probably back in the early 80s, it was viewed, process safety was kind of viewed the same way. Hey, if you don't spend the money on the safety stuff, and we have a good safety record, why do we have to spend this money? And the analogy that we always gave, or I was always taught, is if you think safety is costly, try an accident. So that's the question. If cybersecurity costs a lot of money, what does a ransomware attack that takes a facility down for 2.5 weeks cost you? That's how it's got to be couched, because you have to reduce that threat. You have to spend the money to secure the facility, and you have to ask yourself, okay, if I am impacted and I shut the water system down for the community for 1.5 weeks, what's going to happen? That's a big issue. So you have to look at the cost of what it takes for you to recover from that versus what you're going to do in putting together a cybersecurity budget. That's not everything all at once. It happens over a period of time. Start with locking the doors, locking the windows, the basics, the firewalls, segmentation, and things like that, and build a mature program over time. Don't try to go all and do it at once. Get someone in there that helps you to look at some of those consequences of compromise. Someone that has pragmatic experience and doesn't give you kind of a check the box assessment, like understands the facility, understands the process, walks through it and gets it, and helps you understand what those risky areas are, where you should invest, and where you need to plan to invest.
And one thing we should mention, the incident response team that handled the Kansas water and wastewater system was exceptional. They did all the right things.
the one thing about the Kansas event that we talked a little bit about was their incident response and recovery was phenomenal, because they come out and they use specific words. There's not an issue with water quality. The water is safe to drink. We're working through the anomaly. The production has not stopped. You're free to use your water. The ability to reassure the community when you're going through one of these things is just absolutely fundamental. And it's part of incident response and recovery. It's part of how you approach these things. So I just thought that was very seldom do you hear stories of a cyber attack that was handled, and it was handled well. From the periphery of that article, I will tell you that they had an anomaly. They dove in the manual and they responded correctly to reassure the community. And that's kind of a good story. If we can find a good story in a cyber attack.
So I wonder, are there flip sides? Are there stories, unlike Kansas, where we're not hearing about things going absolutely wrong?
I can't imagine there aren't, but at the same time, I would be conjecture on my part. But you have to really understand it. I mean, if you've ever seen any level of industrial accident or something, the first thing it usually does is show up on Twitter, and smoke's up in the air and everybody's starting to comment. You just don't want to be in that environment. You want to be ahead of it. You want to know. You want to make sure you deal with facts, not fiction or conjecture, and kind of work through the process and making sure everybody's safe. That's the whole thing. Everything is safe, and everything is the water quality and things like that are where it need to be. And that just comes from a background of heavy industry of many years. That from a safety standpoint, that's what we would say. Let's make sure everybody's okay.
Well, that's good to hear. I've done crisis communications for large companies, and I've written what the CEO needs to say in this moment in time. The right words are the best in these situations. And ideally, if you thought them out before the event so that you're not pressed at like 2 a.m. to come up with a coherent statement, you're good.
Exactly. And we recommend drills on it. I mean, that's how far we go. I mean, do a drill on it. Conduct a scenario. Do a drill on it. Can you run the manual? We just experienced a ransomware event. Can we run a manual? Okay, where's our press team? What are we doing? What's going on? Here are the facts. And it's simple things like that make the difference. And I think that's kind of lost sometimes because we get caught up in all these standards. We get caught up in all these requirements. We get caught up in, and the technology is absolutely crucial. You got to have that technology. Trust me, that security technology is crucial, but you also have to have people understanding it. And we always say it's people, process, and technology. It's the people making the right decision. It's the work process that follows, and it's leveraging that technology as far as you can to secure the environment of the business and the operational windows that you have.
So one difference I'm hearing is that you can do tabletop exercises, but with OT, if the manual device doesn't really work, you have to go physically test it out. And when you're in a 24/7 production environment like water, can you pull the system down to do a manual test?
Well, you do it in pieces and parts. So you take one pump, every other pump's in automatic or whatever it may be, and you put that in manual, and you see, okay, do I have everything I need to run in manual? Like I said, one of the challenges is some of this equipment has large variable frequency drives on it, and the output would be in 0 to 100%. And when you go to run in manual, is 80% 600 gallons or 6,000 gallons? So do you have the information you need? And if you don't have the information you need, how do you get it? Or do you communicate via radio to someone that has eyes on what the flow is? So it's that kind of stuff that you can actually write a procedure for it. You can do one pump at a time, make sure you have everything in case, and you can do the analytical measurements because everything usually has backups on it. So there are ways to kind of go through that, and you don't have to take the whole system down. It's particularly on water and wastewater, but you can take pieces and parts down because they usually have backup because they're in a 24/7 operating environment.
So while you're doing your normal maintenance, you should fold security into the process.
Absolutely. What are your, when you are compromised, what will you drop back to?
So does Dave have some general best practices?
Well, there are some best practices out there. And I'll give you a simple one. It's kind of straightforward. I've been to many different types of facilities. And when I go to these different types of facilities, there was only two, one in, one in Marl, Germany, and one in Austin, Texas, where I walked in with my backpack to visit the facility, and they said, please hand me your laptop, all your USBs. I need you to declare everything before I allow you in the facility. So if any of you have ever been on an international flight, you have that customs declaration form you have to fill. Well, kind of common sense from a cyber standpoint, they really didn't want anything crossing the line that they didn't know about. From physical coming through the gate, they didn't want anything through the door. So a simple entry to a facility is a simple policy, it's a simple piece of paper that says, look, I've declared everything that I have, and this is, and I sign off on it. It's that simple, because then you start eliminating some of the physical to logical jumps, if you know what I mean.
These just seem like plant security 101.
Yes, and some places have it. And believe me, some places have it. And they all have it, usually in the bigger industrial plants for safety and things you go through, and you understand all all the safety aspects of it. And in those facilities that are high risk, you'll understand the cyber aspects of it. But in some of these smaller water and wastewater, you're just not going to see that.
And that's largely because of manpower or procedures that just don't come up.
Procedurally, it didn't come up, and there's no big process safety risk or driver for it. It's water in a tank. The safety aspects of it are typically around any chemicals that you have treated, and those are kind of isolated in separate little areas with spill protection and things like that. So you're just not going to see that functional discipline of cyber, if I can say it that way, just because it's just not. You don't have the functional discipline of safety. They're not unsafe plants. It's just they don't have that kind of risk.
Are there signs of hope here? Are we starting to get greater awareness about the problem with OT systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're seeing it. I think in May, the EPA and you can take a look at this. The EPA stated that they're going to include cybersecurity in some of their inspections at facilities, which is a big shift. Typically, it's always been around them looking at safe drinking water aspects and things like that. But they were going to do some level of enforcement that was coming. So we have a blog on the site about that. But I think you're going to see that come to play, where you're seeing a general awareness increase. You're seeing the industry groups kind of increase the chatter on it, and I think everybody's aware of it. And everybody's sort of planning to address it. It's just how fast everybody can kind of come up to speed, and how are the funds there, and can they support it.
I'd like to thank Dave for coming on the show and explaining the situation in Kansas with its water and wastewater system attack. Hopefully this is an anomaly and not something we see more of in the future. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Join us on Discord. Search for Error Code Podcast to join the server, or go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up, including more on hacking water facilities, and also securing OT data physically on the device themselves. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.